Welcome to Late Night Explainer. Tonight, let's begin with a single, small object, a coin. Imagine it resting in the palm of your hand, cool at first, then slowly warming against your skin. It is not large. It weighs about 3.5 grams, which is to say, it weighs almost nothing at all, less than a folded letter, less than a key. You could close your fingers around it and forget it was there. And yet this little disc of gold was, for more than 500 years, one of the most trusted things in the entire world. It was called the Ducat, the gold Ducat of Venice. And the strange, quiet miracle of it is this: it almost never changed. Let that settle for a moment, because it is a deeper idea than it first appears. Picture how much the world changed across 5 centuries. Kings were born and crowned and buried. Whole dynasties rose and fell. Plagues swept across the continent and emptied entire cities. Languages drifted, borders moved, cathedrals were built, stone by patient stone, over lifetimes. And through all of that churning, restless change, one small gold coin from one small city stayed exactly the same weight, the same purity, the same promise. The ducat was introduced in the year 1284 under a doge named Giovanni Dandolo. We will come to what a doge is in time, but for now, simply hold the picture of a leader, an old man in robes, presiding over a decision that would outlast him by centuries. The coin he authorized was made of gold that was very nearly pure, about 99.7% gold, which in the older language is what people meant when they said 24 carat. Almost no other metal in it at all, just gold hammered and stamped and sent out into the world. And here is the thing that made it matter. The Venetians did not cheat it. Not in 1284, not 100 years later, not 300 years later. The weight held. The purity held. Across more than 5 centuries, the ducat stayed essentially unchanged, and that single fact of stubborn, unbroken discipline is what turned a small coin into something far larger than itself. Because everywhere else, kings cheated. This is one of the quiet, recurring sadnesses of money in the old world. A king would need to fund a war or pay an army or finish a palace, and he would not have the gold to do it. So he would do the tempting thing. He would call in the coins, melt them down, and mix a little cheaper metal into the gold before striking them again. The new coins looked the same. They had the same face on them, the same king. But each one held a little less gold than before. This was called debasing the coinage, and over time it was a kind of slow lie told to everyone who held the king's money. A coin that promised gold and delivered less and less of it. Imagine you ran a small bakery and you sold loaves of bread, and quietly, year by year, you made each loaf a little smaller while charging the same price. At first, no one would notice. But eventually they would, and once they noticed, they would never again quite trust the size of your loaf. That is what debasement did to a kingdom's money. It bought the king a little gold today at the cost of trust forever. Venice refused to do this. For 500 years, Venice refused, and so the ducat became something rare and precious in a way that had nothing to do with the gold inside it and everything to do with the trust around it. A merchant in London would accept it. A trader in the Levant, in the markets of the Eastern Mediterranean, would accept it. It traveled all the way to India and was accepted there too. It became, in a real sense, the dollar of the medieval and early modern world. The benchmark, the coin you measured other coins against. Not because Venice was the largest power or the strongest army, but simply because Venice never cheated its own money, and the whole world came to know it. The coin had another name later on. People came to call it the zecchino, after the place where it was made. The mint of Venice was called the zecca, and so the coin minted there became The Zecchino. Say that softly to yourself. Zecchino. It has a glittering sound to it, doesn't it? And here is a small, lovely thread to pull, the kind of thread that connects the deep past to the world you live in right now. That word, zecchino, is where we get the English word sequin. Those tiny glittering discs sewn onto a dress or a costume, catching the light, scattering it. They are named distantly after a Venetian gold coin. The coin was so famously bright and so famously trusted that its name slipped sideways into ornament, into glitter, into the small, shining things we use to make ourselves catch the eye. A coin became a kind of light. So that is where we begin tonight. Not with gondolas, not with masks or carnival, or the pretty postcards of a sinking city, though all of that is real enough. We begin with the unromantic engine underneath all of it. A coin that never lied. Because that coin is the doorway into a much stranger and much larger story, the true story, the one most people never quite reach. The story of how a tiny city built on a swamp, a city with no farmland, no army to speak of, and almost no natural resources at all, somehow became the richest and most ingenious trading power in Europe. And the secret, the thread we will follow all the way down through this long night, is that Venice had nothing physical, so it learned, slowly and brilliantly, to trade in things that were not physical at all, in paper, in trust, in time itself. Before we go further down into it, let me ask you something, and there is no rush to answer. You can simply let it sit in the back of your mind as you drift. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? What city, what time of night, what season is pressing against your window? I find it genuinely soothing to imagine all the different places a voice can reach in the dark, all the rooms, all the quiet, all the people lying still and letting a 1,000-year-old story carry them off. And if you are new here, if you have just found this voice, you are welcome to stay. You can quietly subscribe, and there will always be another long, slow story waiting here for you on another night. But that is enough of that. Let's go back to the water. Because tonight, we are going somewhere very old. We are going to walk slowly through the entire life of the Republic of Venice. The whole arc of it, from the first frightened refugees wading into the marsh, all the way to the last Doge handing over his cap 1,100 years later. We will go gently. There is nothing here to startle you, nothing loud, no sudden turn, just a long, logical, patient accumulation, like a tide coming in over 1,000 years. So let yourself settle. You don't have to follow every name. You don't have to stay awake for the end. The story will keep and the city will still be there, sunk into its lagoon, whether you reach the close or fall asleep somewhere in the middle of it. Either is perfectly all right. Now, let us go back to the very beginning, which is not a beginning of triumph at all, but a beginning of fear. To understand Venice, you have to understand that no one in their right mind would have chosen to live there. The lagoon was not a prize, it was a refuge, a place you went only because everywhere else had become more dangerous. Picture northern Italy in the centuries after the great Roman order had cracked and was crumbling. The roads that the Romans had built so carefully, the towns, the villas, the settled and ordinary life of the countryside, all of it was becoming unsafe. Wave after wave of invaders coming down from the north and the east. There is a specific moment that matters here, a hinge that historians point to. In the year 568, a people called the Lombards came pouring down into Italy, the Lombard invasion. And for the people living on the mainland, in the cities and the fertile farmland of the northeast, this was not an abstract political event. It was the sound of horses and fire. It was a reason to gather what you could carry and run. And where do you run when the land itself is no longer safe? You run to the one place the horses cannot easily follow. You run to the water. Just off the coast, in the curve of the upper Adriatic Sea, there was a lagoon. Not the open sea and not the solid land, but something in between. A wide, shallow, muddy expanse of brackish water, threaded with low, marshy islands, mudflats that appeared at low tide and vanished at high tide, channels that only a local could navigate. It was a confusing, soggy, mosquito-ridden, unpromising place. And that was exactly its value: an invading army on horseback, an army built for the open road, and the cavalry charge simply could not come at you across a maze of mud and shifting water. The lagoon was a wall made of nothing, a defense made of inconvenience. So the refugees came, not all at once, and not in a single dramatic founding. This is one of the gentle corrections we should make, because the popular story gives Venice a tidy birthday. Tradition holds that the city was founded on the 25th of March in the year 421 with the consecration of a little church. It is a precise and pretty date, and you will hear it repeated, and there is no harm in knowing it. But the honest truth, the one the careful historians hold to, is softer and slower than that. There was no single founding day. The settlement of the lagoon happened gradually, across the 5th and the 6th and the 7th centuries, family by family, boatload by boatload, as the mainland grew more dangerous and the water grew more welcome. People came and stayed and sent for others, and slowly the scattered fishing huts on the marsh islands thickened into villages, and the villages, over generations, began to dream of becoming a city. Think about what that meant in practice. These were people who had left behind their farms, their fields, their orchards, the solid ground that had fed their families for generations. They arrived in a place where you could not grow wheat because there was no soil to speak of, only mud and salt water. You could not keep large herds. You could not do almost any of the things that ordinary people in that age did to survive. The lagoon gave them safety and took away, in the same gesture, nearly every normal way of staying alive. This is the seed of everything that follows. Hold on to it as you drift. Venice began as a community of people who had nothing to live on in a place that offered nothing to live on, and who therefore had to invent their way to survival. They could not be farmers, so they would have to become something else, something the world had not quite seen before. But first, before they could become anything, they had to do something almost impossible. They had to build a city on water. And here is one of the quiet wonders of the whole story, a fact so strange it is worth slowing right down for. Venice is not built on land. Venice is built on trees, on millions and millions of wooden poles driven down into the mud beneath the water. Let me explain how this works, because it is one of those things that sounds like a fairy tale and is simply true. You cannot lay a stone foundation on soft mud. The stone would just sink slowly into the ooze like a heavy book pressed into wet clay. So the Venetians did something different. They took long wooden poles made from alder and oak and larch. Sturdy timbers floated down from the forests of the mainland and the mountains beyond, and they drove them down through the soft mud, packed close together, thousands upon thousands of them, until the tips of the poles reached a firmer, more compacted layer of clay deep below. And then on top of that dense forest of buried poles, they laid platforms, and on the platforms they built their stone buildings, their churches, their palaces, the whole shining city. Now you would think, surely, that wood driven down into water would rot. That is what wood does, after all. Leave a wooden post in damp ground, and within a few years it softens and crumbles and feeds the worms. But something extraordinary happens to wood that is driven deep below the waterline and packed into mud. Down there, sealed in by the heavy clay, the wood is cut off almost entirely from oxygen, and it is the oxygen that rot needs. The little organisms that break wood down cannot breathe in that buried, airless dark, and so they cannot do their work. The wood does not rot. Instead, over the centuries, something else happens to it. Minerals from the water seep slowly into the grain of the timber, and the wood begins to harden, to mineralize, to turn, over hundreds of years, almost into stone. The trees petrify. They become as hard as rock. Think of it like this. Imagine sinking a wooden spoon into a thick, airless jar of clay and sealing it shut, and coming back 500 years later to find not a rotted, soggy ruin, but something stone-hard and unbreakable, the shape of the spoon preserved perfectly, only harder than it ever was when it grew on the tree. That is what is holding Venice up. A drowned, petrified forest turned to stone in the dark, bearing the weight of marble palaces above it as if it were bedrock. To give you a sense of the sheer scale of this, consider just one single building, the great domed church of Santa Maria della Salute, which sits at the mouth of the Grand Canal, white and heavy and beautiful. Beneath that one church alone, it is estimated that something like 1,100,000 wooden piles were driven down into the mud to bear its weight. 1,100,000 for a single church. An entire forest felled and floated and hammered down into the dark, just to give one building something solid to stand on. And the whole city, every palace, every bridge, every leaning tower and crowded street, rests on the same kind of hidden, drowned, petrified woodland. Venice floats, in a sense, on the bones of forests. Sit with that image as you lie there. A city of stone and gold and glass, resting its entire weight on a buried forest that turned to stone in the airless dark. Above, the bright water and the light. Below, the silent, mineralized trees holding everything up, century after century, never seen, never thanked, simply enduring. It is a kind of patience, that foundation, a kind of quiet, invisible labor, doing its work in the dark while the city above it grows famous and rich and is admired by the whole world. But a foundation is not a fortune. The poles held the city up, but they did not feed it. The people of the lagoon still faced the same brutal problem they had faced when they first waded into the marsh. The water gave them nowhere to grow food, no fields, no pasture, almost nothing. So how, exactly, did people with no farmland begin to eat? How did a settlement of refugees clinging to mudbanks take the first small step toward becoming rich? The answer, the very first answer, is one of the most ordinary substances in the world, and one of the most precious. The answer is salt. It is easy, in our own time, to forget how valuable salt once was. We have it on every table, cheap and endless, a thing we shake out without a second thought. But for most of human history, salt was treasure. It was the only reliable way to preserve food, to keep meat and fish from rotting through the long months when nothing fresh could be had. Without salt, a side of meat spoiled in days. With salt, it could last a winter. Salt was the difference between feast and famine, between a stocked larder and an empty one, and so salt was wealth. People paid dearly for it, they fought over it. In some places and times, soldiers were even paid partly in it, and there is an old thread of language that connects the word for salt to the word for a soldier's pay, the word that eventually becomes our word salary. To be paid in salt, that is how precious it was. And the lagoon, which could grow no wheat and pasture no cattle, could do one thing magnificently: it could make salt. Here was a wide, shallow expanse of seawater under the warm southern sun. The Venetians built salt pans, shallow enclosures, where they let the seawater in and then let the sun do the work, evaporating the water slowly away until what remained, crusting white along the edges, was salt. pure, valuable salt drawn straight from the same water that had once seemed to offer them nothing. The very thing that had made farming impossible, the salt water of the lagoon, turned out to be a resource in itself. The poverty of the place became, with cleverness, its first wealth. The Venetians did not merely make salt, they came to control it. They took hold of the salt production of the northern Adriatic, the salt pans up and down that stretch of coast, and they built a kind of monopoly around it, a tight grip on both the making and the selling of this white treasure. And the money that flowed from that grip, the revenue from the salt trade, became the first real income of the Venetian state, the first reliable river of money flowing into the public purse. People came to call salt the white gold, and for Venice that is exactly what it was. Not gold dug from a mine, but gold drawn from the sea by patience and sun. The founding fortune, the first engine. And here you can already see in miniature the pattern that will define the whole of Venice's long life. They had no resource, so they made one out of what others overlooked. And then, crucially, they did not just produce the thing, they controlled its trade. They positioned themselves not merely as makers, but as the people through whom the goods had to pass. The middlemen. The bridge, because salt was only the beginning, and the deeper genius of Venice was never really in producing anything at all. It was in moving things and controlling the movement and taking a share of everything that passed across the water. Which brings us to the last great piece of the city's beginning, the piece that determined which way Venice would face and therefore what it would become. Because a trading city is shaped, above all, by who it trades with. And Venice, from its earliest days, was turned toward the east. To understand why, you have to remember that when these refugees first settled the lagoon, the old Roman world had split in two. The western half, centered on Rome, had broken apart into the chaos of invasions and small warring kingdoms. But the eastern half, the great surviving Roman Empire, whose capital was the magnificent city of Constantinople, was still standing, still rich, still powerful. We call that surviving Eastern Empire the Byzantine Empire. And in those early centuries, the lagoon of Venice did not belong to the broken West. It belonged, at least in name, to the East. It sat within the orbit of Byzantine power in Italy, under the authority of the Byzantine governor, whose seat was at Ravenna, in what was called the Exarchate of Ravenna, the easternmost arm of Constantinople's reach into the Italian peninsula. This is a quiet fact, easy to pass over, but it shaped everything. It meant that Venice, almost from its birth, looked east rather than west. While the rest of Italy faced inward toward Rome and the wreckage of the old Western world, Venice faced outward across the sea toward Constantinople, toward the glittering, sophisticated, fabulously wealthy capital of the surviving Roman East. Venice's loyalties, its early politics, its trade, all of it pointed across the water to that great eastern city. And being part of that eastern world, even loosely, even at the edge of it, gave Venice something its rivals did not have. It gave Venice access, privileged access to the markets and the harbors of the East, to the trade routes that carried the riches of Asia and the Levant toward Europe. While other Italian towns were still struggling in the rubble of the Western collapse, Venice already had a foot in the door of the richest commercial world then known, the world of Constantinople, and beyond it, the silk and spice of the further east. Centuries before its rivals would scramble for the same prizes, Venice was already turned toward them, already positioned at the meeting point, already the natural bridge between the eastern world of wealth and the western world that hungered for it. And that is the seed of the whole empire to come. A city of refugees with no land, holding itself up on a drowned forest of petrified trees, feeding itself first on white gold drawn from the sea, and facing from the very start toward the east, toward the source of everything precious, ready to become the gateway through which the riches of one half of the world would flow to the other. They could grow nothing. They could mine nothing. But they sat exactly where two worlds met, and they would learn, with extraordinary patience and cleverness, to take their share of everything that crossed between them. For now, though, let the picture be a simple one. A wide, still lagoon under a low evening light. The water dark and quiet. Low islands threaded with channels. The first rough wooden buildings standing on their hidden forests of sunken poles. The petrified trees holding fast in the airless mud below. Salt crusting white at the edges of the shallow pans. And far across the water, beyond the horizon, the gleam of the great eastern city the Venetians would come to know so well, the city they would one day, astonishingly, turn upon and plunder. But that is a long way off yet, many centuries away, and there is no need to hurry toward it. We have 1,000 years to cross, you and I, slowly, and we have only just stepped onto the first island, the coin that never lied. The forest turned to stone, the salt that became gold, the face turned always toward the east. These are the foundations, the petrified poles beneath the whole story, and everything else we will build upon them gently in the hours to come. So breathe slowly now. Let the lagoon settle around you, dark and calm and patient. There is nothing here that will startle you, nothing loud waiting in the deep water. Only the long, slow rising of a tide that will take 1,000 years to come in and another long span to recede. And we will follow it together, unhurried, into the heart of the city that learned to trade in things you cannot hold, in trust and in paper and in time itself. But before we step from these first muddy islands into the markets where that trade was born, into the place where the very word for a bank would be invented, we must first watch how a handful of frightened refugees on a swamp began slowly to organize themselves into something the world had never quite seen before. And so they organized, not all at once, not according to any plan anyone had drawn in advance, but the way all durable things organize themselves, gradually under pressure, shaped by the specific constraints of the place they were in and the problems they needed to solve. A lagoon demands different answers than a continent. A city with no walls of stone and no farmland and no rivers deep enough for heavy barges must find other foundations, and the Venetians, over the slow course of centuries, found theirs not in rock or soil, but in something stranger and in some ways more durable. They found them in arrangements between people, in contracts, in the careful, formal architecture of agreed obligation. The first of those arrangements was the most basic of all. Someone needed to be in charge. Someone needed to stand at the head of whatever this scattered collection of lagoon settlements was becoming. The Latin word was dux, meaning simply a leader, a guide, and in the Venetian dialect it softened and rounded over time into doge. The title of the first doge, by tradition, was held by a man named Paolo Lucio Anafesto, sometime around the year 697, and for the next 1100 years, a succession of men would wear that title, 120 of them in all, each inheriting an office that was shaped and reshaped by the tensions of a society that needed authority without tyranny, leadership without the surrender of everything to a single will. The Venetians were not a people inclined toward kings. They had come, after all, from the mainland, where kings and lords had done considerable damage, and they had chosen the water partly because the water made it harder for any single man to own everything. The islands were their protection against conquest, and over time, gradually, deliberately, they built a second kind of protection, a constitution that kept even the most powerful man in the Republic from accumulating too much. The mechanism for this was a document called the Promissione Ducale, the Doge's Oath of Office, a written set of binding constraints that every newly elected Doge was required to swear to before he could take up the role. And with each new doge, the promissione grew longer, more detailed, more restrictive, as though the Republic was slowly and carefully closing every gap through which power might leak. The rules were specific and, to a modern reader, almost touchingly practical in their precision. The doge could not open his own correspondence without counselors present to witness it. He could not meet with foreign ambassadors alone. His sons and nephews were barred from holding certain offices so that family interest could not quietly colonize the machinery of state. He could not accept gifts above a certain value. He could not, in effect, behave as though he were a king because the Republic had designed the office with the express purpose of ensuring he was not. He was, in a phrase that becomes more and more illuminating the longer you consider it, a chief executive bound by contract, not a sovereign, not a tyrant, something closer perhaps to what we might now recognize as a very senior employee of a very large organization, granted great dignity and enormous responsibility, but ultimately answerable to the institution that appointed him. That institution was, at its core, the Great Council of Venetian patricians, the Maggior Consiglio, the body that held final legislative authority, and from which all other offices of the Republic ultimately derived their power. And in the year 1297, the Republic made a decision about that council that would define its character for the next 5 centuries. The decision was called the Serrata del Maggior Consiglio, which translates roughly as the closing of the Great Council, and what it meant was this. Membership of the council would no longer be fluid, no longer open to new entrants on merit or fortune, or the goodwill of existing members. Instead, it would be fixed. The families eligible to sit in the Maggior Consiglio were recorded in a register, and that register was called, with a simplicity that carried its own kind of weight, the Libro d'Oro, the Golden Book. If your family name was in the Golden Book, you were a patrician of Venice with the rights and the obligations that entailed. If it was not, no amount of wealth or talent or service to the state would put you there. The gates had closed. The Republic had decided, in effect, to become what a modern observer might recognize as a closed corporation, a body of shareholders, a fixed and registered class of owners who would manage the enterprise of Venice collectively among themselves, electing the officers, directing the policy, inheriting the profits. It was a remarkable act of institutional design, cold and deliberate, and it would keep Venice stable for nearly 500 years in an age when most polities were collapsing into faction or conquest. It would also, as we will see much later, carry within it the seed of a different kind of failure, the failure that comes from closing the doors to new energy and new ideas. But that is centuries ahead, and for now the Golden Book is fresh and the Republic is still young and hungry, and the real business of Venice is beginning. That real business had a location. It had always had a location. And that location was the Rialto. Say the word slowly if you like. Rialto. It sits in the middle of Venice, where the Grand Canal bends in its long S-curve, and for many hundreds of years it was the place where the city's pulse was most clearly felt, the place where everything that made Venice what it was came to concentrate itself into a few hundred square meters of stone and wood and human noise. The Rialto was not just a bridge, though the bridge was part of it. It was a district, a neighborhood given over almost entirely to the business of commerce. And the commerce that happened there was not the simple exchange of goods for coins that happened in any market anywhere. The commerce that happened at the Rialto was something altogether more sophisticated, more layered, and more consequential for the history of the world than anything that had been transacted in the marketplaces of ancient Rome or medieval London or anywhere else in Europe. The stone bridge that most people picture when they hear the word Rialto was not always stone. The bridge itself went through many forms over the centuries, wooden crossings that burned or collapsed or were replaced, until in 1591 a permanent structure in white Istrian stone was finally completed. The architect was Antonio da Ponte, his name a small and pleasing coincidence since da Ponte simply means of the bridge, and his design with its single bold arch and the rows of shops built into both sides of the span lasted intact to the present day, still standing over the same canal, still crossed by the same restless flow of human purpose that has animated the Rialto district for 1,000 years. But the bridge was always secondary to what happened around it. The bridge was just how you got there. What mattered was what you found when you arrived. What you found in the high medieval period and through the Renaissance was Europe's most sophisticated financial center. Not its most glamorous, perhaps, not the most beautiful building or the grandest church, but the place where the mechanisms of modern money were being invented and refined and tested and gradually taught to the rest of the world through the simple medium of merchants copying what worked. The people who made it work were called the banchieri, and the word itself is where we need to pause for a moment, because in that word is one of the most matter-of-fact etymology stories in the entire history of money. A banco is a bench, a plank of wood, a work surface. The banchieri were simply men who sat at benches, at wooden tables, set up in the open air, or under covered arcades around the Rialto, and who had on those benches their scales for weighing coins, their ledgers, and their boxes of different currencies from different states, because in medieval Europe there was no single currency, and a merchant who had just arrived from Flanders or Egypt or the Levant would be carrying money that could not be directly spent in Venice without first being exchanged. The money changers sat at their benches and made those exchanges. That was the original elementary function of the Banco, but as anyone who has ever observed the logic of financial intermediation will immediately guess, the function of the bench did not stay elementary for long, because once a merchant trusted the man at the bench enough to exchange coins there, the next logical step was to ask whether the merchant might also leave some coins with the benchman for safekeeping. And once the coins were in the benchman's custody, the next logical step was to ask whether, instead of physically withdrawing coins to pay another merchant, the benchman might simply note in his ledger that the sum had been transferred, moving the coins from one account to another without the coins themselves changing hands at all. An instruction, a notation, a record. This is giro banking. The word giro comes from the Greek gyros, meaning a circle or a turn, and the image it offers is exactly right. Money turning through the ledger, circulating by notation rather than by the physical movement of metal. When you instruct your bank today to transfer a sum to another account, when a business pays its suppliers by electronic transfer, when any sum of money moves from one ledger entry to another without touching physical currency, you are doing something that the banchieri at the Rialto were already doing in the 12th and 13th centuries, at their wooden benches in the open Venetian air, with quill pens and columns of careful ink. The clearing function that emerged from this was equally powerful. If merchant A owed merchant B a sum, and merchant B owed merchant C a sum, and merchant C in turn had a credit with merchant A, the whole tangle of obligation could be resolved by a series of ledger entries without a single coin being physically exchanged. The bench became a settlement mechanism, a node of trust through which the debts and credits of an entire commercial network could be made to cancel and balance and net out. It was efficient, it was fast, it was dramatically cheaper in transaction costs than any alternative, and it concentrated at the Rialto in the books of the banchieri a real-time picture of the financial state of Venetian commerce that was available nowhere else. Which brings us to the second thing the Rialto was, beside a place of transaction. It was a place of information. And in the medieval and early modern world, information was a form of capital, as valuable as any other, perhaps more valuable, because information moved slowly, arrived unevenly, and the merchant who had it first could act on it while his rivals were still in ignorance. News of a shipwreck in the eastern Mediterranean arrived at the Rialto before it reached anywhere else in Europe, because Venice's ships were everywhere, and Venice's networks were everywhere, and the merchants at the Rialto had every reason to pass on intelligence that might affect prices or routes or the availability of goods. The price of pepper at Alexandria, the harvest of silk in the Levant, the outbreak of plague in a port, the arrival of a competing convoy from Genoa. All of this came to the Rialto, and at the Rialto it was absorbed and priced into the daily judgments of thousands of men who lived and died by the accuracy of their assessments of what goods were worth and what risks were worth running. Control of information was itself Venetian capital, no less real for being invisible, no less powerful for being intangible. The merchants at the Rialto were not simply exchanging goods, they were continuously, in every transaction, in every conversation, aggregating and arbitraging the knowledge of the known world. And from that aggregation came the prices, the exchange rates, the assessments of risk that shaped the decisions of merchants from London to Lisbon to Lviv, because the Rialto was the reference point, the benchmark, the place against which everything else was measured. But we have not yet come to the most important invention that emerged from the culture of the Rialto. For that, we need to go not to the bench of the money changers, but to a contract, a piece of paper, a formal agreement between two people, one of whom was about to sail east and one of whom was staying home. The colleganza. Say that word slowly as well and let it settle. It is not a word that appears in ordinary modern speech, and perhaps that is part of why its importance has been so consistently underestimated by everyone except the scholars who specialize in the economic history of the medieval Mediterranean. But its importance is enormous, and it is not an exaggeration to say that in the colleganza, in this Venetian partnership contract that was already widespread and familiar by the 11th and 12th centuries, you can see the ancestor of one of the most transformative organizational structures in human history. Consider the problem it was designed to solve. A merchant wanted to send goods to Alexandria, or to Acre, or to Constantinople. To do so, he needed a ship, which was expensive, and he needed the goods, which were expensive, and he needed someone willing to make the voyage, which was dangerous. The sea was not a safe place. Ships were lost to storms, to pirates, to the uncertain politics of foreign ports. A merchant who loaded all his capital onto a single vessel and sent it east was making an enormous bet, and if the vessel was lost, the merchant was ruined. This was not a sustainable model. You could not build a great commercial empire on the premise that individual merchants took individual catastrophic risks with their entire fortunes. The colleganza was the solution. It was a contract that split the voyage between two parties, the stans, meaning the one who stays, the sedentary investor who remained at home in Venice, and the tractator, meaning the one who does, the traveling merchant who would actually make the journey, manage the goods, negotiate in foreign markets, endure the sea and the weather and the hazards of the road. The stans provided capital. The tractator provided labor and the willingness to accept physical risk. In the simpler, more common form of the arrangement, the unilateral colleganza, the stans provided all of the capital, 100% of the funds for the voyage, and in return received roughly 3/4 of the profit when the tractator returned. The tractator, for the labor and danger of the journey, received the remaining quarter. But here is the critical element, the feature that makes this not merely a loan or a service arrangement, but something genuinely new. If the voyage lost money, if the ship encountered disaster, or the market turned unfavorable, the losses fell on the capital, which meant they fell primarily on the stans in proportion to what each party had invested. The tractator was not personally liable for a debt they could never repay. They lost their expected profit and the return of their labor, which was loss enough. But they were not crushed under a debt obligation that would follow them for the rest of their lives. In the bilateral form of the colleganza, the tractator contributed approximately 1/3 of the capital themselves, and the split of profits was closer to equal, typically half and half. This version was better for a tractator who had some resources of their own, since the greater capital stake brought a proportionally greater share of the return. What this contract did at the level of the whole society was mobilize capital that would otherwise have sat idle. The widow with a small inheritance who could not sail to Alexandria could nonetheless invest in the voyage of a trusted merchant and receive a share of the profit. The elderly craftsman who had accumulated savings over a lifetime but had no taste for the sea could place that capital in the hands of a younger, more adventurous man and let it work. The clergyman, the minor official, the artisan, all of them could participate in the wealth of the Eastern trade without leaving Venice, without owning a ship, without knowing the first thing about navigating the Adriatic. And on the other side, a talented, courageous young merchant with no capital of his own could nonetheless enter the trade, could build relationships and reputation, and gradually accumulate enough to become a stanz himself, investing in the voyages of others while his own body aged and the sea became less appealing. It was, in this way, an engine of social mobility of remarkable power. It opened the highest reward activity the Venetian economy offered, the Eastern trade, to people at every level of the society, connecting the capital of the cautious stay-at-home with the energy and courage of the wandering merchant, sharing the risk between them in a way that made the total system more resilient than any individual actor could be on their own. Scholars who have studied the social structure of Venice in this period have found evidence of exactly this mobility in action. Families rising from artisan backgrounds to merchant wealth within a generation or two, the colleganza as the ladder, and in its structure you can see, if you look carefully, the clear outline of mechanisms that would become central to modern capitalism. The separation of capital from labor, the sharing of risk according to capital contribution rather than labor, the limitation of the traveler's personal liability, the mobilization of the savings of non-specialists into productive investment. These are not superficial resemblances. They are the same underlying logic worked out in a different time and place, but pointing toward the joint stock company, toward the limited partnership, toward the whole apparatus of investment that eventually produced the great trading companies of the 17th century and the financial markets of the centuries after that. The colleganza was the seed. Venice was the soil. But Venice was not just the soil for commerce, it was also the soil for the particular kind of governance that commerce requires, which is to say, a governance that was itself organized and disciplined and, in a very specific sense, corporate. We have already met the Doge, that carefully constrained chief executive bound by his promissione. We have seen the Serrata of 1297, the closing of the Golden Book, the moment when the Republic formally became a closed corporation of patrician families. Now we need to look at the machinery that kept this corporation honest, that prevented it from being captured by any one family or any one man, that maintained over centuries the institutional integrity on which everything else depended. The body responsible for this was founded in 1310 in the aftermath of a crisis. The crisis was called the Tiepolo conspiracy after the family at its center, Bahamonte Tiepolo, and his allies had attempted to overthrow the government of Venice in a coup, to seize power by force and replace the collective rule of the patricians with something more like personal dominion. The coup failed. Venice crushed it with the efficiency that the Republic consistently brought to threats to its own structure. And in the aftermath, the Republic created an institution designed to ensure that nothing like it could succeed in the future. The institution was the Consiglio dei Dieci, the Council of Ten. In practice, the Council of Ten often operated with more members than its name suggested, since various committees and supplements expanded it at need, but the name stuck, and the name carried exactly the right connotations: small, focused, secretive, powerful. The Council of Ten became the intelligence and security organ of the Venetian state, responsible for internal threats, conspiracy, treason, and the hundreds smaller betrayals of public trust that a complex society constantly generates. It operated with a speed and a secrecy that the other organs of Venetian government, with their elaborate procedures and multiple checks, could not match. When the state needed to act quickly and quietly, the Council of Ten acted. Its most evocative tool, and the one that most clearly conveys the character of the institution to a modern imagination, was a series of stone boxes built into walls throughout the city of Venice. They were called the Bocche di Leone, the mouths of the lion. Each was carved to resemble the open jaws of a lion, the great symbol of Venice, of St. Mark, of the Republic, and into those stone mouths any citizen could drop a piece of paper bearing an accusation. An anonymous denunciation, a report of suspected treason or conspiracy or crime against the state, delivered without signature, without the accuser having to reveal themselves or stand before anyone or face any consequence at all. The accusation went into the mouth of the lion, and the Council of Ten received it, and from that point the machinery of Venetian justice moved in ways that were largely invisible to the outside world. There is something that lingers about those stone mouths. They were everywhere. They were part of the texture of the city, built into churches and palaces and the outer walls of public buildings, and every citizen who passed them knew what they were for. The effect this had on daily life, on the quality of conversation, on the calculations a person made before speaking openly about the state or about a powerful neighbor, is not difficult to imagine. Venice was, in its way, a surveillance state in the only form a pre-modern society could achieve. Not total and not perfect, but sufficient to make the awareness of possible observation a constant, low-level presence in the minds of its citizens. The lion's mouth listened. Someone was always watching, always. The Council of Ten used these accusations and its other methods to manage one of the central challenges of any oligarchic republic: what to do when one of the oligarchs decided he wanted everything. The temptation was always there. A sufficiently ambitious doge with the prestige of the office and the loyalty of certain families might look at the republic around him and think that he could do better alone, that the endless committees and councils and checks and balances were simply obstacles between him and what he wanted. The Venetians had a clear answer to this temptation, and the clearest illustration of that answer was painted over on the wall of the hall of the Great Council in the Doge's palace. The Doge in question was Marino Faliero. He came to office in 1354, an old man already, 70 years old at his election, and if Venice had expected in him the usual carefully managed figurehead they were, within a year proved wrong. Faliero conspired with a group of artisans and workers to overthrow the patrician government, to massacre the leading families of the Republic, and make himself absolute lord. The conspiracy was discovered, as conspiracies in Venice tended to be, with a speed that suggests the intelligence apparatus was working exactly as intended. Faliero was tried by the very council whose destruction he had planned. He was found guilty. On the 17th of April in the year 1355, on the very staircase of the Doge's palace where he had been acclaimed on his election, Marino Faliero was beheaded. And then Venice did something that is in its way more remarkable than the execution itself. In the hall of the Great Council, where the portraits of the Doges were painted in a long series high on the wall, marking the succession of legitimate authority from the very beginnings of the Republic, the space that should have held the portrait of Marino Faliero was draped in black. A painted shroud, and across the shroud, in the place where his face should have been, where his name and dates and titles should have been recorded like those of every doge before and after him, the Republic instead painted words that said, in their plain, final Latin, that here was the place of Marino Faliero, who was beheaded for his crimes, not erased, not simply left blank as though he had never existed. Something more deliberate than that, a visible, permanent reminder that the state had existed before him, would exist after him, and had found him insufficient. The shroud is still there, the words are still there. Travelers who visit the Doge's palace today can stand in that room and look up at the long line of Doges and find the one black gap, the one covered space, and understand in an instant something essential about the character of the republic that built that room, that Venice was bigger than any one man, that the institution was the point, that the long continuity of the republic stretching back to those first uncertain islands in the lagoon was more important than any ambition any individual could bring to it. The state as corporation, the shareholders meeting every time as more powerful than the CEO. This was the architecture, and it was the architecture that made everything else possible, because a trading empire runs on trust, and trust requires institutions that are predictable, that do not depend on the mood or the health or the ambition of a single person, that are governed by rules rather than by will. A merchant in Alexandria calculating whether to extend credit to a Venetian buyer needed to know that the Venetian buyer was operating within a system that would hold him to his obligations, that had mechanisms for enforcement, that would not collapse into chaos if the current doge fell ill or the current council was replaced. The Promissione Ducale, the Maggior Consiglio, the Serrata, the Council of Ten, and its lions' mouths, the painted-over portrait in the Great Hall, all of these were, in their way, trust infrastructure. All of them were the Republic's promise to itself and to the world it traded with that Venice would keep its word. And the word that Venice kept day after day, for century after century, in the ledgers of the Banchieri at the Rialto, and in the contracts of the colleganza, and in the careful records of the Monte and the Zecca, and 100 other offices of state, was the word of a city that had decided very early that its survival depended not on walls or armies, or the fertility of its land, but on the credibility of its institutions. In that decision, made gradually and under pressure, made not by theorists but by merchants who needed things to work, Venice built something that the world had not quite seen before and would not quite see again until, centuries later, the great commercial republics of the north, Amsterdam and London, began to build their own versions of the same underlying idea. The idea that a state could be run like a firm, that citizens could be, in a meaningful sense, its shareholders, that the rules governing the firm could be made explicit, written down, enforced, and that the firm's credibility was its most valuable asset. None of this was inevitable, none of it was easy, and none of it existed at first in any form that we would recognize as sophisticated. The Banchieri at the Rialto began as simple money changers, sitting at their wooden benches with their scales and their bags of coins. The colleganza began as an informal arrangement between neighbors, a way of splitting the risk of a single voyage between two men who trusted each other enough to write it down. The Council of Ten began as an emergency measure after a coup attempt, a temporary body that, like many temporary bodies in the history of governance, found itself in permanent service. The Promissione Ducale began as a simple oath and grew, clause by clause, over centuries, into the detailed constitutional document it eventually became. This is how institutions work. When they work well, they grow under pressure, they accumulate solutions to specific problems. They become more elaborate, not because anyone planned their elaboration, but because each new failure, each new crisis, each new attempt at abuse revealed a gap that needed to be filled. The Venetians were extraordinarily good at filling those gaps, at learning from their own failures and encoding the lesson into the structure of the state, at building a republic that remembered its own history and used that memory to make itself harder to break. It was a slow kind of intelligence, stretched across generations, incapable of being located in any single mind or any single year, belonging instead to the whole long conversation of the Republic with itself through its councils and its offices and its libraries and its law. It was, in the deepest sense, institutional intelligence, and it was this, more than any individual genius, more than any single invention, that made Venice what it was. Not one merchant who thought of the colleganza, not one doge who conceived the promissione, not one banker who invented the giro, but a whole society across many generations that kept finding better answers to the same essential questions. How do we keep anyone from taking too much? How do we make promises that people will believe? How do we share the risk of the sea without destroying the men who sail it? How do we build something that will last? The water was still outside the windows of the Rialto banking houses, dark and quiet as it always is in the hours before dawn, the boats rocking gently at their moorings, the voices of the night watchmen moving through the narrow calle. And inside those buildings, in the light of oil lamps, the ledgers lay open, their columns of carefully inscribed figures holding, in their dry and patient way, the living record of everything the city had built and everything it owed, and everything it was still becoming. The Republic was at work, it was always at work, and it was not enough in the end to be good at counting, not enough to have the ledgers straight, the books balanced, the giro entries made with a careful hand. The wealth of Venice had to come from somewhere, and for centuries it came from one direction above all others, east. Always east, from the silk roads and the spice routes, from the harbours of the Levant and the warehouses of Alexandria and the long dusty caravans that wound down from the mountains of Anatolia and Persia and beyond. The city faced east the way a sunflower faces the light, instinctively, structurally, as though it had no choice, which in a sense it did not. There was nothing to the west worth trading for. The wealth was in the east, and Venice had learned that lesson early, and had never forgotten it. Consider for a moment what the Venetians were actually selling. Not the goods they made themselves, not the fish from the lagoon or the salt from the pans of the northern Adriatic, though those things mattered. What they were selling at the highest margins in the quantities that built palaces and funded fleets were things that grew or were made in places so far from Venice that most Europeans could not have pointed to them on a map. Pepper, which came from the Malabar coast of India, a journey of months by sea and land and sea again. Cinnamon from Ceylon, the long curled bark that perfumed the warehouses of the Rialto and cost more per ounce than most labourers earned in a week. Cloves from the Banda Islands, an archipelago in the far eastern seas whose existence most of Europe did not suspect. Nutmeg, ginger, mace, and silk, the extraordinary material that the East had been producing for millennia before a single silkworm found its way west, cloth so fine and so luminous that wearing it was a statement not just of wealth, but of access, of connection to a world most people would never see. To a medieval European, these were not luxuries in the modern sense, mere pleasures to be enjoyed and forgotten. They were necessities of a particular kind, substances that preserved food in a world without refrigeration, medicines of real and imagined power, materials whose scent and texture signaled status in a society where status was everything. Pepper, in particular, functioned almost as currency. It had been used to pay rents and tributes. It could be weighed and exchanged and trusted in the way that coin could be trusted. And the markup between what it cost at the source and what it fetched at the Rialto, passing through the hands of Arab merchants and Venetian factors and Rialto brokers, was, by any modern measure, staggering. Venice did not merely buy and sell these things. It organized the entire machinery of their movement across half the known world. The fondaci were a central part of that machinery, From the Arabic word funduk, the fondaco was a combination of warehouse, trading post, residence and counting house, a piece of home territory planted in a foreign city where Venetian merchants could store their goods securely, sleep safely, worship in their own way, and conduct business under the protection of whatever treaty Venice had negotiated with the local power. Venice maintained fondacy in Alexandria, in Beirut, in Acre, in Tyre, across the ports of the Levant and North Africa, wherever the trade routes ran. And at home, reciprocally, Venice hosted foreign merchant communities with the same institutional thoroughness. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the house of the German merchants, sat just beside the Rialto bridge, a great rectangular building around a central courtyard, where merchants from the German-speaking lands lived and worked and stored their wares under Venetian supervision. They were guests of a particular kind. Venice welcomed their business and monitored their movements, taxing them carefully, ensuring that the flow of goods through the Fondaco was visible and countable. It was hospitality in the Venetian sense, which meant it was also control. The Fondaco dei Turchi stood along the Grand Canal, a building whose arched facade reflected in the water, housing the Ottoman merchants who came to Venice to trade. And here is the thing that requires a moment's pause to appreciate fully. Venice traded robustly with the Ottoman Empire even during periods when the two states were officially at war. The commerce continued. The merchants went on meeting, the fondacy went on functioning, the goods went on moving because the economic logic of the trade was simply too powerful to be interrupted by the political logic of conflict. This was not hypocrisy, or not merely hypocrisy. It was a consistent, principled position, which was that commerce was a good in itself, that the city's survival depended upon it, and that the interruption of trade hurt everyone and helped no one. Venice had understood something that many states would take centuries to learn, which was that wealth circulates, and when you stop its circulation, you do not keep it, you simply destroy it. There were men in Rome and elsewhere who found this accommodation with the Muslim world scandalous. There were popes who excoriated Venice for trading with the enemies of Christendom. Venice listened politely and kept trading, because the Fondaco dei Turchi and the Fondaco dei Tedeschi were not symbols of moral compromise. They were symbols of what made Venice different from every other power in Europe, which was the absolute, unsentimental primacy of the ledger. Into this world, into this great east-facing machine of organized commerce, was born in Venice around 1254 a boy named Marco Polo. His father and his uncle were merchants of the kind that Venice produced in its best and most typical form, not adventurers in any romantic sense, but professional travelers, men who understood that the journey was the price of the profit, and who had cultivated over long years of trading in the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, the kind of practical knowledge of foreign places and foreign customs that was itself a form of capital. They had been, before Marco was old enough to travel, all the way to the court of the great Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler whose empire stretched from China to the edge of Persia, the largest contiguous land empire in history, and they had been received there with courtesy and sent back westward with a commission to return. Marco went with them on the second journey, departing Venice in 1271. He was 17 years old. He would not return for 24 years. What he saw in that quarter century is the subject of the book that was dictated in his name while he was a prisoner in Genoa, after being captured in a naval battle in 1298. The book was titled, prosaically, Description of the World, but it acquired the nickname by which it is still sometimes known, Il Milione, the million, because it was said Marco Polo was so given to describing things in millions, such vast numbers of people and animals and distances and riches, that his countrymen doubted him and gave him the nickname as a kind of gentle mockery. He described the palace of Kublai Khan in Khanbalik, which we now call Beijing. He described the paper money that the Mongol Empire used, money made of nothing but the state's authority, which must have astonished every Venetian who read it. He described the coal that burned in China, the black stone from the earth that gave heat, which Europeans would not commonly use for another century or more. He described the size of the Chinese navy, the Silk Roads, the spice ports of the Indian Ocean. The book was dictated to a man named Rustichello de Pisa, himself a writer of romances, which may account for some of the book's colour. Historians debate, carefully and honestly, how much of Il Milione is direct observation, and how much is the combination of observation, hearsay, Rustichello's literary embellishments, and the simple distance of memory stretched across 24 years of travel. But this much is certain: Il Milione became the most influential European account of Asia for the 2 centuries following its composition. It was copied, translated, read, argued over, believed in part and doubted in part, and consulted by navigators who were trying to understand what lay at the far end of the world's geography. One of those navigators, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, carried with him on his voyages a heavily annotated copy of Marco Polo's book. The margins of Columbus's copy, which survives, are filled with his own notes and observations, places he expected to find, distances he calculated, evidence of a man using a Venetian merchant's testimony to construct his mental map of where he was going. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he believed, or perhaps half believed, that he was reaching the eastern shores of the world Marco Polo had described. The book was wrong in several of its particulars, but it pointed, and pointing was enough to change the shape of everything. Marco Polo himself came back to Venice, grew old, married, had 3 daughters, and died in 1324 at approximately 70 years of age, a respected and prosperous merchant, leaving to his heirs, along with more conventional property, the golden tablet that Kublai Khan had given him as a form of passport and safe conduct, a physical object from the far side of the world, a piece of the Khan's authority held in a Venetian house. Whether he was believed in his own lifetime or not, whether the millions he described were taken as fact or as travelers' exaggeration, the book he had made remained in the world, patient and persistent, waiting for someone to use it. While individual merchants like Marco and his family were pushing the edges of the possible, the Venetian state had developed a more systematic approach to moving goods along the established routes. This was the system of the Mude, the state-organized merchant convoys that were among the most sophisticated commercial logistics operations in the medieval world. The word Muda meant, roughly, a fleet organized for a specific route, and there were several: the Muda to Alexandria, the Muda to Beirut, the Muda to Flanders in the northwest, the Muda to the Black Sea in the northeast, each following a regular schedule, departing at appointed times, stopping at appointed ports. The galleys that made these journeys were in many cases built and owned by the state, which then auctioned the cargo space on them to private merchants. You could walk to the relevant office in Venice and bid, at a public auction, for the right to fill a portion of a state galley with your own goods on the next sailing to Alexandria. The state set the schedule. The state provided the armed escort because these galleys were also warships, a deliberate design choice that turned every trading voyage into a defended convoy. And the state auctioned the carrying capacity to whoever would pay the most for it, creating a market in shipping space that was itself a kind of financial instrument, a contract for future delivery across the sea. This was, in its quiet way, remarkable. The state did not simply permit trade to happen. It organized trade, scheduled it, protected it, and profited from it in a manner that kept private commerce flourishing while ensuring the state's own interests were served. It was the public-private partnership elevated to an administrative art form, and it moved the goods of the Eastern trade into European markets with a regularity and reliability that no private operation, however well funded, could have matched alone, and the galleys that made the Mude possible, the ships themselves, were produced in a place unlike anything else in the medieval world, the arsenale. The very name comes from the Arabic Dar al-Sina'a, meaning house of manufacture, a word Venice absorbed from the same Eastern Mediterranean world that supplied so much of its commercial vocabulary. It was founded around the year 1104 in the earliest centuries of the Republic's commercial expansion on a tract of land in the eastern part of the city, bounded by canals, and over the centuries it grew and kept growing until by its peak it covered roughly 45 hectares, which is to say something in the vicinity of 110 acres, an industrial city within the city, enclosed by walls, guarded by gates, operating under rules of secrecy so strict that unauthorized entry was a serious criminal matter. At its height, the arsenale employed something in the order of 16,000 workers, men known as the arsenalotti, a community of craftsmen and laborers so large and so central to the city's life that they had their own privileges, their own identity, their own place in the social geography of Venice. They lived largely in the neighborhood around the arsenale, forming a kind of guild community within the broader community of the city. They were skilled, carpenters and caulkers and rope makers and sail makers and oar shapers, each specializing in one part of the great task of making ships, each part of a production system so well coordinated that it achieved something the modern world would not rediscover until the early 20th century. The arsenale used standardized interchangeable parts. Every galley was built to a specification. The oars were the same length, the planks cut to the same dimensions, the rigging assembled to the same measurements. This meant that when a part broke, it could be replaced without custom craftsmanship. It meant that the workers knew their task precisely because it was always the same task. And it meant that galleys could be produced, fitted, and sent to sea in a process that a modern observer would recognize with a slight shock of recognition as an assembly line. A galley hull, once built, would be floated into a long canal that ran through the heart of the arsenale. As it moved along this canal, it passed successive stations. At one station, the masts and rigging were added. At the next, the oars and rowlocks. Further along, the weapons, the crossbows, the bolts, the siege equipment, whatever the voyage required. Further still, the provisions, the water barrels, the food supplies for the crew. By the time the galley reached the far end of the canal and passed through the gates into open water, it was a complete warship, ready to sail and fight, assembled not by a team of craftsmen working on a single vessel from start to finish, but by sequential specialists, each adding their component as the vessel passed through their station. The Spanish traveller Pero Tafur visited Venice in 1436 and left an account of what he witnessed, and what he describes has the quality of something that startles even in retrospect. He watched a galley pass through the fitting-out canal, he wrote, and emerge at the far end fully armed and equipped in what he judged to be the space of 6 hours. 6 hours for a complete warship, crewed and provisioned to pass from hull to sea-ready vessel. Tafur was an eyewitness testifying to what he saw, and eyewitnesses exaggerate, and the arsenale at full mobilization was an exceptional circumstance, not its everyday pace. But even if we discount the figure generously, even if we allow that the reality on an ordinary day was slower and more complicated than the exceptional demonstration a foreign visitor might have been shown, what remains is still extraordinary. A production system of a sophistication and a throughput that the rest of Europe simply could not match, and that the world would not systematically reproduce until the factories of the Industrial Revolution 6 centuries later. And it was not only travelers who noticed. Dante Alighieri, who lived from 1265 to 1321 and who was a contemporary of Venice's high commercial power, wrote the Arsenale into the Inferno. In Canto 29, describing one of the circles of hell, he reached for the most vivid industrial image available to his imagination, which was the boiling black pitch of the Venetian shipyard, the sticky, steaming substance used to caulk the hulls of galleys and make them watertight. The sinners in that circle are plunged into the pitch, just as the arsenali workers plunged their tools and materials into the great cauldrons of boiling tar. Dante used the arsenali as a metaphor for hell's own industry, which tells us something about how the place registered in the medieval imagination as a place of ceaseless, organized, almost supernatural productive intensity where the fire was always lit and the work never stopped. The galleys that the arsenali produced were not merely commercial vessels. They were instruments of state power in the fullest sense, capable in the same voyage of trading at one port and fighting at the next, their cargo holds and their weapon racks existing in the same hull. And they were the tools that made possible the most audacious and most morally complicated event in Venetian commercial history, the Fourth Crusade. In the year 1201, a group of French and Flemish nobles arrived in Venice with a commission. They were organizing a crusade, the fourth great Christian military expedition to the Holy Land, and they needed ships. They needed a great many ships, enough to carry, as they calculated it, approximately 33,500 men, 4,500 horses, and all the provisions and equipment that such a force would require. They had come to the right city. There was nowhere else in Europe that could have built such a fleet, and they knew it. The negotiations that followed were conducted with the aged Doge of Venice, a man named Enrico Dandolo, who was at this point in his 90s and, by the accounts of contemporary sources, essentially blind, his sight having failed him years before, possibly as a result of a head wound sustained in Constantinople decades earlier, though the precise cause is uncertain. He was, by any measure, an extraordinary figure, old, blind, vastly experienced, and possessed of a political intelligence that age had not diminished in the slightest. He addressed the Crusade's envoys in the great hall of the Maggior Concilio, proposing a contract, and then he took the proposal to the Venetian people assembled in the church of San Marco, because a decision of this magnitude required not just the consent of the council, but of the city itself. The contract they agreed was specific and binding in the way Venetian commercial contracts always were. Venice would build and provision the required fleet, supplying transport galleys, warships, and provisions for 9 months, in exchange for 85,000 silver marks. Venice would also contribute 50 warships of its own, in exchange for an equal share of any conquests. The target was Egypt, which was the strategic prize. Whoever held the Nile Delta held the gateway to the Eastern trade, and a crusade that took Egypt would have accomplished something of lasting commercial value, not merely a symbolic liberation of Jerusalem that would require constant defending. The Venetians did what they had promised. They spent a year building the fleet. They diverted resources from other enterprises. They committed the productive capacity of the arsenal and the shipyards to filling this single order. And when the time came for the Crusaders to arrive and pay and sail, far fewer men came than had been counted. The great lords who had signed on had been unable to deliver the troops they had promised for reasons of politics and logistics that had nothing to do with Venice's own preparation. The money that arrived fell significantly short of the 85,000 marks that Venice was owed. Here, the story becomes complicated in a way that is worth sitting with carefully. Venice held the Crusaders at the Lido, the long sandy barrier island at the edge of the lagoon, neither releasing them to sail without the fleet, nor releasing the fleet without payment. It was an impasse. The Crusaders were broke. The Venetians were owed a great deal of money they had genuinely spent building ships they had genuinely built. And in the negotiations that followed, what emerged was an arrangement that would redirect the entire enterprise toward ends that had nothing to do with Jerusalem. Zara, the city on the Dalmatian coast known today as Zadar, was a trading rival of Venice. It had once been under Venetian control and had defected. The crusade could pay its debt, Dandolo suggested, by helping Venice recapture it. And so in the autumn of 1202, the greatest military force assembled in the name of Christendom turned its weapons on a Catholic city populated by Christian people who had done nothing to deserve the assault. Pope Innocent III, when he learned of it, was furious. He excommunicated the entire crusade, the soldiers and the Venetians both, for attacking a Christian city while on a holy mission. The excommunication did not stop anything. The crusade took Zara. And then, in the winter of 1202 to 1203, still on the Adriatic, far from Egypt and further still from Jerusalem, the next redirection began. A young man arrived, a Byzantine prince named Alexios, who had a claim to the throne in Constantinople, and a proposition: help him take back his throne, and he would reward them extravagantly, reuniting the Eastern and Western churches, paying the army's remaining debts and providing additional forces for the Crusade's original mission. The offer was attractive, and the arguments for accepting it were not entirely without logic. Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom, was rich and strategically central. A friendly emperor there would open all kinds of possibilities. Whether Venice deliberately engineered these redirections toward commercial ends is one of the genuine open questions of medieval history. What can be said with honesty is this: the financial causation is clear and documented. The crusade was redirected because of an unpaid debt and a subsequent series of transactions in which each diversion was offered as a way to settle what was owed. And Venice was the overwhelming commercial beneficiary of what followed. The intent, the question of how much of this was calculated strategy and how much was opportunistic improvisation by old Dandolo, reading a sequence of situations as they presented themselves, that question is genuinely debated among serious historians, and it should be held open rather than resolved. What happened in 1204 is not debated. The Crusaders and their Venetian allies reached Constantinople. Their initial attempt to restore Alexios succeeded briefly. Alexios was crowned emperor, but he could not deliver on the extraordinary promises he had made, and within months he was overthrown and killed by his own people. The debt remained unpaid. The Crusaders and Venetians, now committed to a city they could not afford to leave and could not afford to placate, made the decision that still echoes across the centuries. In April of 1204, they sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, the heir of Rome, the keeper of antiquities, libraries and churches and artworks accumulated across 1,000 years, was looted by an army that had set out to liberate Jerusalem. The sack lasted for 3 days and was, by any contemporary account, catastrophic. Churches stripped of their treasures, palaces emptied, libraries burned, populations assaulted. Robert de Clary, a French knight who was there, described wealth so great that he could not believe what he was seeing, riches that he struggled to find words for, accumulated over centuries, now dispersed in days. Enrico Dandolo, blind and in his 90s, was not watching from a distance. The accounts describe him in the prow of his own galley during the assault on the sea walls, leading from the front with a physical courage that must have been, given his age and his blindness, something remarkable to witness, whatever one thinks of what he was doing. He would not leave Constantinople after the conquest. He died there in 1205, and he was buried in the great church of Hagia Sophia, the vast cathedral built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, which had been the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity. He is, by one reckoning, the only person known to have been buried inside Hagia Sophia. A Venetian merchant, the architect of Christianity's assault on its own greatest city, interred inside its holiest building. History sometimes achieves an irony that fiction would not dare. The settlement after the conquest divided the Byzantine Empire. Venice received what the documents describe as a quarter and a half, which is to say 3/8 of the former empire, a phrase that has the careful precision of a contract because that is exactly what it was. More practically, what Venice received was a chain of strategic ports and islands that formed the backbone of a maritime empire in the eastern Mediterranean. Crete, most importantly, which would remain Venetian for 4.5 centuries and serve as the great base from which the eastern trade could be supplied and defended. Harbours along the Greek coast, islands in the Aegean, the ports of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, not grand territorial dominion, not palaces and farmland and populations to tax, but the nodes of a network, the stations of a route, the harbours where ships could shelter and goods could be stored and water could be taken on. It was, as always with Venice, the practical choice dressed in the clothes of conquest. The 4 bronze horses of San Marco were among the objects brought back from Constantinople. They had stood for centuries above the spina of the Hippodrome, the great racetrack at the heart of Byzantine Constantinople, and before that they had travelled a longer road still. Through antiquity, their precise origins disputed even now, though they are believed to date to the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. Venice took them to the west and mounted them above the great doorway of the Basilica of San Marco, where they stood for 6 centuries as an advertisement visible to everyone entering the square of what Venice had done and what it had taken, the most literal possible symbol of a city that treated the world's treasures as items that could be moved from one ledger to another. The Fourth Crusade was not the end of anything for Venice. It was, in a very real sense, a reinforcement of the foundations. The chain of ports that Venice acquired gave the Mude their eastern anchors. The destruction of Byzantine commercial power removed the most significant eastern competitor to Venetian trade. The conquest demonstrated, as nothing else quite could, the ultimate subordination of every other consideration, including religious obligation and papal authority, to the logic of the balance sheet. Venice had, in the course of 3 years, excommunicated an entire crusade, sacked a Christian city, sacked the greatest Christian city, and emerged with a maritime empire and no enemies it could not manage. The Pope's anger subsided, the trade went on, the arsenal kept building galleys, the Mude kept sailing, the ledgers stayed open. And all of this, the spices and the silks, the fondassi and the Mude, the arsenale and its 16,000 workers, the crusade and its consequences, all of it rested on something that had been building quietly in the background since before the Fourth Crusade, something that was in its own way as remarkable as any battle or any conquest, something that most people who think about Venice never quite reach, the financial instruments that made the empire possible and that would outlast it by centuries. But before we go there, let us rest for a moment in the image that the Fourth Crusade leaves behind, because it is worth holding. An old blind man in the prow of a galley, a debt unpaid, an army sworn to God's service, redirected by the mathematics of what was owed. 3 days of looting in the greatest city in the world. And at the end of it, entered into the ledger with the same careful hand that entered a cargo of pepper or a payment of interest on a forced loan. 3/8 of an empire. The Venetian way was not to be shocked by any of this, it was to add it up correctly and write it down. The water outside the Rialto was beginning to show the first pale suggestion of morning light, that slow transition from black to deep grey that happens on the lagoon before the sun is anywhere near the horizon, a softening rather than a brightening, as though the darkness was simply growing less certain of itself. The bells of the city had not yet begun. The boatmen on the Grand Canal were still sleeping, or some of them were, and the great buildings on either bank stood in their reflections in the water, stone and shadow, and the occasional lamp that burned through the night in some window where someone was working still, because in Venice someone was always working still, and so we turned to the instruments themselves, the machinery underneath the empire. The part of the story that tends to get left out because it is less dramatic than a crusade and less beautiful than a palazzo, but which is, in many ways, the most extraordinary thing Venice ever built. It begins with a debt the state owed to its own citizens, the prestiti. The word comes from the Latin for a loan, a thing given in advance and expected back. But these were not voluntary loans in the way we might understand that term today. They were forced. When Venice needed money for a fleet, for a war, for a diplomatic crisis that demanded swift spending, the state reached into the pockets of its wealthier citizens and compelled them to lend. The mechanism was the estimo, a regular assessment of household wealth, a census of private fortune that the Republic maintained with the same bureaucratic thoroughness it applied to everything else. Your wealth was estimated, entered into the record, and then a portion of it was declared owed to the state, not as a tax, not as a gift, but as a loan. You would be repaid with interest, approximately 5% per year, drawn from the state's own revenues, the customs duties that came in daily at the ports, the salt income that had been the Republic's financial backbone from the beginning, the profits of the great commercial machine. The interest payments flowed from the revenues of empire. As long as the ships came home, the interest was paid. And because the ships almost always came home, and because Venice was conspicuously not the kind of state that reneged on its obligations, the citizens learned to trust the arrangement. The prestiti became, in time, not a burden, but an investment. A way of putting your money to work for you while the state put it to work for itself. But here is the part that moves from interesting to extraordinary. The claims recorded in the Monte, the great central ledger where the Republic kept track of every outstanding prestiti obligation, every name, every sum, every interest entitlement, those claims could be sold. Not redeemed early, not cashed in at the treasury, sold, transferred. A citizen who needed liquid money before his interest payments came due could find another citizen willing to buy his claim at whatever price the two of them agreed upon. And those prices, those transactions, those agreements made daily in the arcaded streets around the Rialto created something that the world had never quite seen before in this form, a secondary market in government debt. A place where you could buy and sell a piece of the state's future obligations. And the price at which those obligations traded told you something that no herald, no official announcement, no Doge's proclamation could tell you with the same honesty. It told you what people actually believed about Venice's prospects. When the Republic was at peace, when the fleets were profitable, when the customs revenues were flowing and the salt trade was strong, the prestiti traded near their face value. The market said, yes, we believe this debt will be paid. When war came, when a fleet was lost, when an epidemic moved through the city and the docks went quiet, the prestiti fell. Not because anyone decided they should fall, because sellers needed cash and buyers demanded compensation for the risk they were taking on. The price fell to 80 to 60, sometimes, in the darkest moments, far below that. A claim worth 100 on paper might sell for 40 or 30 in the middle of a catastrophe. And that number, that market price, it was a kind of truth the state could not manufacture. It was what the collective judgment of thousands of individual Venetians, each acting in their own financial interest, believed about the Republic's health. The bond price was a confidence index, a live, continuously updating measure of public trust. Centuries before any modern credit rating agency, centuries before the concept of sovereign risk was formalized into institutional language, Venice had already built the instrument that expressed it. The state paid attention. When the prestiti fell sharply, it was a signal. When they recovered, it was another. The market in government debt was not just a financial mechanism. It was a feedback loop between the people and the state, running in numbers rather than words. And then consider what this meant strategically. A state that reliably services its debt, that pays its 5% year, after year, even when the treasury is under pressure, builds a reputation over time that is worth money in a very direct sense, because that reputation allows it to borrow again, and to borrow more cheaply than a rival that has defaulted or been known to cheat. Venice's financial credibility was a weapon, not a metaphorical one, a real one. When the Republic needed to raise money quickly for a naval emergency, it could compel the loans, yes, but it could also, because of its reputation, attract voluntary participation from people who saw Venetian debt as safer than almost anything else available to them. The state's trustworthiness was an asset on the balance sheet, as real as any galley, as valuable as any warehouse full of pepper. There were moments. The Chioggia War of the 1370s comes to mind, when Genoa nearly strangled Venice completely, when the prestiti fell to devastating levels and the state was forced to borrow at terrible cost. But Venice always found a way through, and the finding a way through became part of the reputation, which made the next borrowing cheaper, which made the next emergency more survivable. Financial credibility compounded across time in the same way that interest compounded, slowly at first, then with accelerating force. This is the thing that the modern financial world understands, and that Venice understood first in practice, if not yet in formal theory. A government that manages its debt well does not just pay for today's war, it purchases the ability to fight tomorrow's. It buys time. And time, for Venice, sitting in its lagoon between the appetites of every great power in Europe and the East, was always the most precious commodity. But the prestiti system, for all its elegance, had limits. It depended on there being enough wealthy citizens to compel and enough revenue to service. And the private banking system that had grown up around the Rialto, the individual money changers and deposit takers who sat at their benches, who received deposits and made book transfers, who had made the Rialto the clearinghouse of European commerce, that system kept breaking. Private Rialto banks failed. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. A banker would take in deposits, make loans, overextend, and when confidence wobbled and depositors came to withdraw at once, the bank would collapse. Depositors would lose their money. The shock would ripple through the commercial community. Credit would freeze. Ships would sit at dock for want of financing. And then, slowly, the private banking sector would reconstitute itself, and the cycle would begin again. The Republic watched this happen, and it drew conclusions. The same intelligence that had built the arsenal and the state convoy system and the promissione ducale, the institutional habit of identifying a problem and engineering a structural solution, turned its attention to banking. In 1587, the Venetian Senate established the Banco della Piazza di Rialto, a public bank, state-owned, state-guaranteed, operating not to make a profit for private shareholders, but to provide a secure and stable deposit and transfer service to the commercial community. If you deposited money in the Banco della Piazza di Rialto, the full faith of the Venetian state stood behind your deposit. The bank would not overextend, it would not speculate, it would not make the gambling loans that had brought down its private predecessors. It would receive deposits. It would allow transfers between account holders by book entry. The giro system, money moved by a notation in a ledger without a single coin changing hands, and it would remain solvent. A second public bank, the Banco del Giro, followed in 1619, eventually taking on the functions of the first and becoming the central node of the Republic's payment system. The name Giro, meaning a turn, a rotation, a circuit, describes the motion perfectly. Money circulates through the accounts without ever quite touching the ground. One merchant's credit becomes another's debit by the stroke of a pen. The velocity of commerce accelerates because the friction of physically moving metal from hand to hand is removed. Trade that would have required a chest of silver traveling through uncertain roads now happens as an entry, as an agreement, as a notation in a book, that the state guarantees. This is the backstop lesson, the one that every financial crisis in history teaches, usually at great cost, and that Venice had already learned and institutionalized by 1587. A commercial economy needs a stable public institution at its heart, one that will not collapse when private confidence wavers, one whose solvency is underwritten by the state's own authority. The Banco della Piazza di Rialto is an ancestor of the Bank of England, chartered in 1694, of the Wissel Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, of every central bank and public deposit institution that followed. The form that Venice pioneered, the public backstop, the state-guaranteed ledger, the system that keeps commerce moving when private credit freezes, is the form the modern world still depends on. Beyond the banks, there was another kind of instrument entirely, not one that moved money, but one that captured and communicated it. The operating system of capitalism, as a later generation would say. The merchants of Venice had long practiced a method of keeping accounts that tracked every transaction on two sides simultaneously, every asset matched by a liability, every debit balanced by a credit. Money owed to you and money owed by you recorded in columns that, when added, had to reconcile. The elegance of this is that it makes errors visible. A set of books that does not balance contains a mistake, and the mistake is detectable, locatable, correctable. A set of books that does balance might still be wrong in its entries, but it will not be wrong in ways that compound silently. The double entry system enforces a discipline on the record keeper that single entry never could. This practice, refined and practiced daily in the counting houses of the Rialto, was codified and published in 1494 by a Venetian friar and mathematician named Luca Pacioli in a remarkable text called the Summa de Arithmetica, Geometria, Proporzioni et Proporzionalità, a comprehensive gathering of mathematical knowledge that included, as one of its sections, the first printed systematic description of double-entry bookkeeping. Pacioli did not claim to have invented the method. He described what the merchants already did. He made it explicit, teachable, portable. He gave it the form in which it could travel, and travel it did. The Summa de Arithmetica was printed in Venice in 1494, at a time when Venice was already the printing capital of Europe. Within a generation, merchants across the continent were learning from it. Within a century, double-entry bookkeeping was the common language of commerce wherever serious trade happened. It remains so today. The spreadsheet your accountant opens in the morning, the software that tracks every transaction your company makes, the auditable record that every publicly traded corporation is required to maintain, they all descend from what Luca Pacioli wrote down in Venice in 1494, describing what the Venetian merchants had quietly perfected over the previous 2 centuries. The printing of the Summa is itself significant. By 1500, Venice had more printing presses operating within its boundaries than any other city in Europe. The technology of movable type introduced by Gutenberg in the middle of the previous century had found its most enthusiastic and capable home in the Republic that had always understood information as capital. Among those Venetian printers was a scholar from Bassano who had settled in the city and who would, with extraordinary ingenuity, change the physical form of the book itself. Aldus Manutius, the Aldine Press. Working in Venice in the last years of the 15th century and the opening decades of the 16th, Manutius made 2 innovations that restructured the relationship between books and readers. He introduced italic type, a compact, slightly slanted letter form that could fit more text onto a page, derived from the humanist handwriting of the Italian scholars whose work he was printing. And he introduced the octavo format, a book made from sheets folded 3 times, rather than the larger folio or quarto, resulting in a volume small enough to fit in a coat pocket, light enough to carry without effort, affordable enough to be owned by people who were not nobility or monasteries. The portable book, the paperback, in its essential form. Minutius published Virgil, Dante, Petrarch, the Greek classics, the great texts of antiquity, and he made them available to anyone who could read and who had a modest sum to spend. Venice, the city that had always traded in things, found itself also trading in ideas. Knowledge became an export. The humanist intellectual project, the recovery and circulation of ancient learning, moved through the presses of Venice and across Europe, and much of what the Renaissance carried in its hands was carried in books printed in the Republic's workshops. Murano glass, those objects of impossible lightness and clarity, was another kind of secret that Venice kept and marketed with the same controlled ferocity it applied to everything else it valued. The decision in 1291 to force all glassmakers to relocate from the city of Venice itself to the island of Murano, about 1.5 miles across the lagoon, was presented as a safety measure. Venice burned. Wooden structures, thatched roofs, accumulated centuries of flammable material. A glassmaker's furnace was a genuine fire risk, and the memory of terrible fires lived in the city's institutional memory. Moving the furnaces to an island made practical sense, but it also served another purpose entirely. On Murano, the glassmakers could not easily leave. They were concentrated, observable, controllable. The secrets of Cristalla, the extraordinarily pure, clear glass that Venetian craftsmen had developed and that no other European workshop could yet replicate, were kept on the island. A glassmaster who took those secrets elsewhere did so knowing that Venice's reach was long and its displeasure serious. The knowledge itself was property of the Republic, even if the Republic's name did not appear on any deed. Industrial secrecy enforced by geography. The island as a kind of living patent, which brings us to an instrument that is easy to overlook, but which points towards something essential in Venice's character. In 1474, the Great Council of Venice passed a statute that granted inventors the exclusive right to practice and profit from their new devices within Venetian territory for a limited period of time. 10 years typically, with the expectation that after that period, the knowledge would enter the public domain and others could use it freely. In exchange for this temporary monopoly, the inventor was required to actually use the invention, to reduce it to practice, to put it to work in the economy. You could not simply sit on an idea and exclude others from it forever. You had to build. You had to produce. And then, after the protected period, what you had built would belong to everyone. The Venetian Patent Statute of 1474 is among the earliest systematic patent systems in recorded history. It treated ideas as property with a defined legal form, a mechanism for protection, and a built-in expiration that served the public interest. The modern patent system, which underpins the economics of pharmaceutical research, of semiconductor design, of biotechnology, of every industry that depends on the protection of intellectual investment as an incentive to invest in the first place, that system traces a line, directly or indirectly, to what Venice codified in 1474. Scarcity of physical resources had driven Venice to value abstractions, and a city that valued abstractions eventually recognized that knowledge itself needed the same institutional protection that a warehouse of spice or a galley full of glass received. Intellectual property as a concept. Venice, 500 years before the term existed. But all of this, the bonds and the banks and the bookkeeping and the press and the patents, was built on the foundation of Eastern trade, on the flow of pepper and cinnamon and silk and cotton and sugar and all the other luxuries that moved through the Venetian entrepot from the markets of the Levant and Egypt and beyond. And that flow depended on something Venice did not control and could not ultimately defend. It depended on access. And in 1453, on a Tuesday in late May, the access began to close. Constantinople had fallen. The armies of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II had breached the walls of the city that had stood as Christendom's eastern frontier for more than 1,000 years. The last emperor, Constantine XI, had died in the fighting. The city that Venice had plundered in 1204, from which it had taken its bronze horses and its trade privileges and its quarter and a half of the empire, that city was now the capital of a rising Ottoman state that Venice would spend the next 3 centuries negotiating with, fighting, and carefully not quite antagonizing enough to lose completely. The Ottomans were not barbarous or commercially incompetent. They were sophisticated rulers who understood trade as well as Venice did, and they were perfectly willing to deal. Venice and the Sublime Porte struck agreements, paid tribute where necessary, maintained trading access at a cost, and continued doing business. The Fondaci adapted, the merchants adapted. The Fondaco dei Turchi, by the Grand Canal, remained a working institution, the Venetian state's careful management of its relationship with the power that now controlled the eastern end of all the trade routes. But the power balance had shifted. The access that Venice had once held almost by right, backed by the force of its own fleet and the political weight of its Byzantine connections, was now a privilege extended by another state on that state's own terms. The terms could change, the access could narrow, and with every new war, Negroponte fell to the Ottomans in 1470, and the grief in Venice at the news was said to be like a bereavement. The cost of access rose, and the confidence of the old order declined. The Republic adapted, it always adapted, it reinforced the mood, sought new trading connections, negotiated, made concessions, paid what it needed to pay. Venice, in the second half of the 15th century, was still stupendously wealthy and still the dominant commercial power of the Mediterranean. The decline was not yet visible in the counting houses or on the docks, but something had changed in the fundamental geometry of the world that Venice occupied, and the men who ran the Republic were alert enough to feel it, even if they could not yet see its full shape. And then came the summer of 1498. A Portuguese captain named Vasco da Gama had left Lisbon the previous year with 4 ships and a commission from the Portuguese crown to find a sea route to India. He had sailed south along the African coast, around the Cape of Good Hope, at the continent's southern tip, north up the eastern coast of Africa, and then across the Indian Ocean to the port of Calicut on the Malabar coast of India. He arrived there in the spring of 1498. He found pepper, he found cinnamon, he found the spices that Venice had always obtained through the long, complex, taxed, intermediated chain of the Levantine trade. And he found them at the source, on the coast where they grew, reachable by open ocean from Lisbon, without a single Ottoman customs post, without a Venetian agent, without the accumulated margins of every hand the goods had passed through on the way west. The news reached Venice in the summer of 1498. A Venetian diarist named Girolamo Priuli recorded it. Priuli wrote that the Portuguese discovery would be the ruin of the Venetian state. Not might be, would be. He was a merchant. He understood exactly what had happened, and he did not dress it in diplomatic language or institutional optimism. The route around Africa was longer in miles, yes. It was harder on ships, yes. But it eliminated every middleman between Lisbon and the pepper groves of Malabar. And if you eliminated the middlemen, you eliminated the need for the middleman's city. Venice had been, for the better part of 5 centuries, the bridge between East and West, the connector, the entrepot through which the luxury goods of Asia passed on their way to the tables and dressing rooms and apothecaries of Europe. That position, geographic, commercial, relational, had been the source of almost everything. The wealth, the fleet, the financial instruments, the political power, the cultural brilliance, the arsenal, and the Rialto, and the bonds, and the banks, all of it had been built on the fact that if you wanted pepper in Paris or cinnamon in London, you needed Venice. You did not need Venice anymore, not for that. Priuli was right about the direction. He was wrong about the speed. Venice did not collapse in 1498. It was still, by almost any measure, the most sophisticated commercial and financial state in Europe. Its institutions were strong, its credit was good, its fleet was powerful, its craftsmen were the best in the world, and the habits of discipline and innovation that had built the Republic over 1,000 years did not evaporate because a Portuguese captain had found a new route. The Ottoman trade, though more costly, continued. New strategies were developed. The Republic pivoted as it always had, finding the available margins and exploiting them. But the structural truth was irreversible. The center of European commercial gravity was moving west. Portugal first, then Spain, then, with increasing force and sophistication through the 16th and 17th centuries, the Dutch and the English. These were Atlantic-facing powers. They sat on the ocean that was now the most important ocean in the world. The Mediterranean, which had been the center of everything for so long that its name meant simply the sea in the middle of the world, was becoming a smaller, more enclosed, more peripheral space. And Venice, which had always been the Mediterranean's most accomplished operator, was geographically locked inside it. There is an irony here so precise it almost seems designed. The position that had made Venice great, the bridge between east and west, the connector between the land routes of Asia and the sea routes of Europe, became a liability the moment the West learned to sail directly to the east. The bridge was made obsolete by the ship that didn't need it. The very thing that had forced Venice to invent all those instruments, the bottleneck position, the scarce physical circumstances, the absolute necessity of being cleverer than rivals who had more land and more soldiers, that very thing became, in the end, the condition of its decline. The decline was long and, in many of its phases, genuinely beautiful. Venice in the 16th and 17th centuries was the home of Titian and Tintoretto and Veronese, and later Vivaldi. The Republic that had always moved money with a kind of aesthetic ferocity turned that energy toward painting and music and architecture and glass and theatre and all the arts that don't require a sea route to Asia. The carnival, with its masks and its licensed excess, became a form of international tourism that the city managed with the same institutional sophistication it had once applied to the Mude. Visitors came from all over Europe to see Venice, to experience its strangeness and its beauty, to attend its operas and its theatres, to buy its glass and its books and its silks. The city discovered that it was itself a product, that its very existence, the improbable fact of it, the accumulated grandeur of 1,000 years of maritime empire sitting in a lagoon on wooden piles in the northern Adriatic, was something people would travel to see. This was not nothing. It was, in fact, a remarkable transformation. A state that had built its fortune on the movement of goods through a geographic choke point found a new kind of value in the thing it had built, the city itself. Venice became what it remains today, a monument so singular that the world considers it among the most precious objects on earth, worth protecting, worth visiting, worth writing about endlessly, worth imagining as it must have been when the fleets were sailing and the Rialto was the center of European finance and the arsenal was hammering out galleys at a rate that no other power in the world could match. The terra firma, the mainland territories that Venice had begun acquiring in the early 15th century, as a hedge against the possibility that sea trade might someday falter, became more important. The Republic became more of a regional Italian state and less of a global maritime empire. Its agriculture developed. Its mainland cities, Bergamo, Brescia, Verona, Padua, contributed to its revenues and its political weight within the Italian peninsula. Venice had always regarded the terra firma somewhat condescendingly as the domain of farmers and landlords rather than merchants and sailors. But it was there, and it was productive, and as the sea trade declined, it became an increasingly significant part of what the Republic was. Cyprus fell to the Ottomans in 1571 after a war that produced one of the most famous naval battles of the century at Lepanto, where a combined Christian fleet destroyed the Ottoman navy, and then found that the victory changed almost nothing. The Ottomans rebuilt their fleet within a year. The strategic situation was essentially unchanged. Venice lost Cyprus in the diplomatic settlement anyway, and then after the longest and most costly siege in the Republic's history, 21 years, from 1648 to 1669, Crete fell too. The Siege of Candia, as the Venetians called it, was a final, exhausting, genuinely heroic last act of the old maritime empire. Venice fought for Crete with everything it had for 2 decades against a power that could replace its losses faster than Venice could replace its own. In the end, Crete passed to the Ottomans, and the Aegean Empire that had been assembled in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, island by island and port by port, was essentially gone. What remained was the city itself. Wealthy, beautiful, intricate, functional, still governed by the institutions that had evolved over 1,000 years. The Great Council still met. The Doge was still elected by the Byzantine process of successive ballots and lotteries designed to prevent any faction from controlling the outcome. The Council of Ten still read its secret letters. The Bocce di Leone were still set into the walls of the ducal palace, their stone mouths open, receiving whatever a citizen wished to report. The Promissione Ducale was still read aloud at every election, binding the new Doge before he had even put on the robes of office. The forms persisted long after the substance had changed. This is what institutions do when they are well enough designed. They maintain themselves through the conditions that gave rise to them, and then continue to maintain themselves even as those conditions recede. Venice had built its government to last, and it lasted, just no longer as an empire, more as a custodian of something remarkable that had once been built. The city's population had declined from its medieval peak. The wealth, though reduced, was still real. The financial institutions, the Monte, the public banks, the bond markets, continued to function. The Republic still serviced its debts. Venetian glass was still the finest in the world. The printing presses still ran. The legal system, the postal system, the diplomatic service, all the infrastructure of governance that Venice had built over centuries continued to operate with the professional competence that had always been one of the Republic's hallmarks. And then came 1797. Napoleon Bonaparte had swept through northern Italy with an army that made the military forces of every Italian state look antique by comparison. The treaties he was negotiating, the territory he was reorganizing, the old powers he was brushing aside. It was a new world being made by force, and it had no particular patience for the picturesque survival of a medieval republic in a lagoon. Venice, by the final decade of the 18th century, was a state that had been declining for 300 years but had never quite stopped functioning. It was no longer a military power of consequence. Its navy was a shadow. Its terra firma territories were economically important but militarily indefensible against a French army that had just remade the map of Italy by force of will and artillery. The Great Council, assembled in its great hall beneath the painted ceilings that Tintoretto and Veronese had covered with allegories of Venetian glory, faced a choice that was not really a choice. Napoleon demanded the dissolution of the Republic. The last Doge was Lodovico Mani. He had been elected in 1789, the same year the French Revolution began, a coincidence of timing that carries its own dark poetry. On the 12th of May 1797, Manin called the Great Council into session for the last time. The debate was brief, and the outcome was not in doubt. The council voted to dissolve the Republic, to end, by formal democratic act, the governmental structure that had been operating, in one form or another, since before the year 700. It is said that when the vote was done, Manin removed the ducal cap, the corno, the distinctive horn bonnet that was the Doge's ceremonial headgear, and handed it to a servant, saying he would not need it again. More than 1,000 years, 120 Doges, the salt pans and the wooden pilings and the colleganza contracts and the gold Ducat and the arsenal and the mudi and the prestiti and the Banco della Piazza di Rialto and the patent statute and the summa de arithmetica. All of it. Handed to a servant with a Doge's worn hat. Venice was then distributed as a bargaining chip. The Treaty of Campo Formio, signed later that year between Napoleon and Austria, assigned the city to Austrian rule, as casually as one might transfer a bale of cotton from one merchant's ledger to another's. The city that had always been the one doing the trading was now the thing being traded. The republic that had turned goods into financial instruments, that had abstracted the physical into paper and trust and credit, was itself reduced to a physical thing, a city, a set of islands, a geographic fact, passed from one great power to another. The longest-lived republic in history. That is what the Venetians are sometimes said to have built. More than a millennium of continuous self-governance, of elected leadership, of institutional checks against tyranny, of a system designed to survive any individual within it, even the Doge. Even Marino Faliero, who tried to make himself a king and died for it. Even the succession of crises, the Chioggia War, the Ottoman conquests, the loss of the Eastern trade, that might have destroyed a less carefully constructed state. It voted itself out of existence, not conquered in battle, not overthrown by its own citizens, not destroyed by plague or fire or flood, though Venice had known all three. It simply decided in a room full of old men sitting beneath the painted allegories of its own glory that it was finished, and perhaps there is something appropriate in that. A state that had always treated governance as a form of management, that had always preferred the cool rationality of institutional process to the hot emotion of personal power, ended its existence with the same procedural composure it had brought to everything else. The vote was taken. The count was certified. The cap was removed. The entry was made in the ledger. What Venice left behind is not merely a city, though the city is extraordinary, and the debate about how to preserve it, how to keep the wooden pilings from failing beneath the weight of 1,000 years, how to prevent the rising waters of the Adriatic from reclaiming what the refugees of the Lombard invasion had built their improbable home upon, that debate continues. What Venice left behind is something more portable than stone and water, more durable than the bronze horses of San Marco, which Napoleon also took when he dissolved the Republic, packing them off to Paris where they stayed until the Austrians eventually sent them home. What Venice left behind is a set of ideas about how to organize collective economic life, about how to share risk so that anyone could invest in a voyage, not just the rich and the well-connected, about how to make a government's creditworthiness legible, tradable, visible as a number on a market, about how to create a stable public institution that stands behind the private credit system when private credit breaks down, about how to protect the investment in ideas with a legal instrument that rewards invention without allowing monopoly to calcify, about how to keep accounts so that every entry is checked against every other entry and no error can hide indefinitely in the dark. These ideas did not stay in Venice. They traveled, as Venice had always made things travel, through the ports and the presses and the counting houses and the treatises. The colleganza became the joint stock company. The prestiti became the sovereign bond market. The Banco del Giro became the model for the Whistle Bank of Amsterdam and later the Bank of England. Luca Pacioli's Summa became the operating system of global commerce. The Patent Statute of 1474 became the intellectual property framework that modern economies depend on, A city built on nothing, no farmland, no army, no natural resources except salt and position, and the collective intelligence of people who had learned across generations that when you have nothing physical to offer, you had better become extraordinary at organizing the abstract, at moving trust, at packaging time into a tradable instrument, at making the invisible the creditworthiness of a state, the potential profit of a voyage not yet made, the value of an idea not yet built, visible, legible, buyable, sellable. Scarcity forced abstraction. That is the Venetian lesson. And the abstraction once invented turned out to be more powerful than the scarcity that had required it. The water outside has grown quieter, if water can be said to grow quiet. The lagoon does something in the deepest hours of the night that it does at no other time. It settles into a stillness so complete that the lights on the water do not move, do not waver, but simply hold their positions in the dark reflection as though the city and its image have agreed for a few hours to be the same thing. The Rialto bridge still stands, stone since 1591, lined with its little shops, its arches spanning the Grand Canal at the point where the water bends and the great palaces catch the morning light. The Arsenale gate is still there with its stone lions, and beyond it, the silence of what was once the largest industrial complex in the world. The Bosche di Leone are still set into the walls, their mouths open to whatever anyone might choose to say. The Zecca, where the gold ducats were minted with their unchanging purity, is still there, repurposed as old buildings must be, but still standing in its place at the edge of the Piazza. And somewhere beneath the city, beneath the great churches and the palaces and the narrow walkways and the bridges and the wells, below the waterline and deeper still, in the mud and the cold water that the Adriatic has pressed against these islands for as long as anyone has lived here, the wooden pilings, the millions of alder and oak and larch stakes driven by hand into the lagoon bottom by people who needed, urgently, to build something solid on a surface that offered nothing solid. Submerged, deprived of air, petrified over centuries into something harder than they had ever been when they were living wood. Holding up a city that should not exist, refusing to give way. There is something in that image worth carrying into sleep with you, if you will allow it. The idea that a thing pressed hard enough against impossible conditions does not simply fail, that it can, given time, become something harder than it was, that the absence of what you need can become, under certain pressures and over certain centuries, the source of what you build. Venice had nothing, and from nothing, from salt water and mud and the stubborn ingenuity of people who had no other choice, it built the instruments that the modern world still uses to move money, to price trust, to share risk, and to protect the value of a new idea. Not because it was trying to invent the future, but because it was trying day by day and century by century simply to survive. And it did. For 1,000 years, it did. If you have found your way here tonight, through all of it, the refugees and the salt and the ducat and the colleganza and the arsenal and the crusade and the bonds and the banks and Vasco da Gama's terrible news in the summer of 1498 and the last Doge removing his cap, then wherever in the world you are listening from, whatever city or room or quiet corner of the night you are resting in, I hope the story has been worth the journey. Leave a note in the comments if you feel inclined. Tell me where you are. I do read them, all of them. And there is something companionable about knowing that someone in one part of the world and someone in another have traveled together through the same 1,000 years in the dark. There are more stories of this kind here, slow and careful, waiting for whenever you want them. You have done enough for one night. Put down whatever remains of the day. The lagoon is quiet. The pilings are holding. The water is still. That's enough explaining for one night. Rest now.